The first time I saw the $500 lien, it was just a thin gray line on my online account ledger. A little line item, sandwiched between my usual monthly assessment and a late fee that should not have been there. The ceiling fan hummed above me, pushing warm air around my living room while the blue light of my laptop screen made everything feel colder. The description was bland, almost boring: non-compliance fee, June 15th, unauthorized exterior apparatus. It took me a second to even process what that meant. Then my stomach dropped because I knew, in the worst possible way, what unauthorized exterior apparatus was code for. It was not a satellite dish, not a giant neon sign, not junk piled on the porch. It was two dark green rain barrels tucked neatly along my tiny back wall, quietly catching the stormwater that used to gush uselessly from the downspout and flood the walkway. I sat there staring at that $500 line, thinking about how wild it was that in this little patch of townhomes, just catching free water falling from the sky could be treated like a crime. I had read enough homeowners association drama online to know that these stories never start with something big, they always start with something petty and ridiculous. I just never expected to be living my own HOA revenge story, and I definitely did not expect a lien to be the opening act. Outside, I could hear a delivery truck beeping as it backed up near the mail kiosk, the sound echoing between our rows of beige siding. Everything in our complex always echoed: footsteps on the shared sidewalks, doors closing, arguments carried through thin walls. We lived close enough that you could smell your neighbor's dinner, but the board still pretended we were each isolated little kingdoms, each porch a battlefield over appearances. That $500 lien was their opening shot. They just did not know I still had their own rulebook in my hands. I did not find out about the lien until after months of little paper cuts, little power plays, little hints that my barrels had become somebody's obsession. To understand how a pair of plastic barrels turned into a financial threat, you have to see how tight everything is in our complex: space, parking, money, and above all, control. The board loved control the way some people love gardening or fantasy football. They cultivated it, watered it with rumors, pruned it with warning letters, and showed it off in meeting minutes. Our townhome complex is the kind of place built for maximum density and minimum breathing room. 3-story cookie-cutter units share walls like dominoes, stacked in long rows with narrow strips of landscaping between them. On hot afternoons, the sunlight bounces off the pale stucco and makes the parking lot shimmer, while the faint smell of chlorine drifts from the community pool. From above, we probably look like a tidy grid. From ground level, it feels like a maze where every turn puts you one step closer to someone else's front door. When I bought my unit, the sales brochure used words like eco-conscious community and shared conservation values. The welcome packet came with a glossy trifold pamphlet about water-wise living, filled with stock photos of smiling families with low-flow showerheads and drought-tolerant plants. Tucked into the same folder was the real heart of the place: a thick, spiral-bound copy of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I remember flipping through the CCRs the first week and seeing a tab someone had added at CCR section 4.3, titled Exterior Modifications and Appearance, highlighted in neon yellow like a warning sign. At the time, it felt abstract. I read the words about uniform aesthetics, approved color palettes, and committee discretion, and I shrugged. My attitude was simple: I would pay my dues on time, keep my porch swept, and stay out of trouble. As long as I followed basic common sense, I assumed the association would leave me alone. I should have remembered that rule number 1 with any close-packed community is this: there is always someone whose hobby is minding your business. In our case, that someone was my immediate neighbor across the narrow strip of grass, a woman I will call Marlene. Marlene treated the complex like her personal stage, patrolling the sidewalks in workout clothes with a clipboard and a phone she held in landscape mode, ready to record anything she considered suspicious. Even before the rain barrels, I had seen her staring too long at people's flower pots, porch chairs, even brand new welcome mats that she thought looked off-brand for our little grid of beige. The first real hint of trouble came during a dry spring. The local news kept talking about drought, sprinklers, and fines from the city for wasting water. Our utility bills crept up, the grass in the common areas turned patchy and sad, and the board started posting reminders about responsible usage on the community bulletin board by the mail kiosk. Inside the next monthly newsletter, there was a cheery half-page spread about water conservation. It praised homeowners who reduce stormwater runoff and harvest rainwater responsibly. The tone was smug, like the association was proud of something we had not actually done yet. That little article sat in the same packet as an insert reminding us about strict enforcement of exterior rules, including a note that any changes needed approval from the architectural committee. I stared at that spread and thought about the way the walkway behind my unit flooded every time it rained. Water would pour from the downspout on my back wall, rush along the concrete, and pool at the low spot by the gate. On stormy nights, it sounded like someone dumping buckets against the siding, the rush of water drowning out the sound of cars on the nearby main road. I had slipped more than once stepping into that puddle in the dark. That is where the idea for the rain barrels came from. Not from a blog, not from a neighbor, but from sitting on my small patio one rainy evening, watching water slam into the ground and thinking it was ridiculous to pay rising rates for tap water while free water was violently crashing right past my feet. The air smelled like wet concrete and damp mulch, and the slanted light of a late storm made the whole walkway shine. Catching some of that water felt practical and kind of satisfying, like a quiet rebellion that hurt no one. I did not rush into it. I checked the CCRs again, searching for anything that mentioned barrels, rain collection, or cisterns. There was nothing specific. The closest language was a vague line under CCR Section 4.3, all exterior equipment and fixtures shall be subject to board or committee approval at their sole discretion to maintain uniform aesthetics and safety. That line bothered me, but I also remembered that newsletter bragging about rainwater harvesting. The same association that claimed to love conservation could not reasonably punish someone for doing exactly what its own pamphlets praised, right? To stay on the safe side, I chose barrels that matched the existing color scheme, dark green, matte finish, no bright logos. If you were not looking for them, they almost disappeared against the shrubbery. I set them up one weekend when the late afternoon was warm and cicadas buzzed faintly in the nearby trees. Crouched behind my unit, I adjusted the diverter so that part of the downspout fed into the barrels and the overflow still drained safely away. When the first light rain hit their lids, it sounded like a soft drumbeat tucked under the patter on the rooftops. For the first time, I felt like I had done something smart for my little corner of the complex. For exactly 3 days, nobody seemed to notice. Then Marlene did. I did not see the moment she discovered the barrels, but I could tell from the shift in her behavior. The next week, I started catching her lingering by the narrow strip of grass behind our units, her eyes flicking toward my back wall the way people glance at a stain they cannot ignore. When I stepped out to toss recycling in the bin, she would suddenly have a reason to be out there too, fiddling with her hose or repositioning a potted plant, always angled so she had a clear view of the barrels. The early evening light would catch on the metal clip of the tape measure she kept hanging from her waistband, like she was ready to audit the world at any moment. Soon after that, the notes began to appear. Not on my door at first, but on the community bulletin board and in the inboxes of everyone on the association's email list. Reminders about how any exterior equipment had to be pre-approved. Blurred photos of unapproved items, in common areas, cropped so tightly that you could not tell whose unit they belonged to. A paragraph about how certain apparatuses might attract pests or pose a safety hazard to children. Nobody said the words rain barrel, but I saw a familiar curve in one of the photos, that distinctive rounded side, and my stomach knotted. It was like watching someone point a flashlight through your window without quite entering your house. The board was sending a message, and it was aimed right at the back of my unit. I tried, at first, to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they would send a polite question asking what I had installed. Maybe we would have a grown-up conversation about safety, overflow, and aesthetics, and I could point to their own conservation pamphlet and suggest we find a compromise. After all, the barrels sat flush against the wall, secured, with the lids closed. They were cleaner than some of the broken lawn furniture left near the dumpster. Instead, about 2 weeks after I set them up, I received my first official piece of paper, courtesy violation notice, slid under my front door. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon cleaner from the hallway floor. It referenced CCR Section 4.3 Exterior Modifications and CCR Section 7.2 Nuisance and Attractive Hazards, claiming that my unapproved water storage devices might encourage mosquitoes or cause water damage, even though the design specifically prevented standing open water. The notice was dated May 30th and gave me 10 days to remove the barrels or face escalating action. 10 days to undo something that actually solved a problem, in order to protect a sense of uniformity no one had bothered to define clearly. Right at the bottom, in a smaller font, it warned that further non-compliance could result in fines and additional remedies as permitted under the governing documents. That 10-day deadline sounds small, but in a place where control is the only real currency, it was a test. Would I quietly obey, or would I push back and force the board to show just how far they were willing to go over plastic barrels and stormwater? I sat with that notice spread on my kitchen counter, the afternoon light stretching across the laminate like a spotlight on the words. Part of me wanted to avoid drama, haul the barrels to storage, and be done with it. But another part remembered the rainwater pamphlet, the cheerful talk of conservation, and how the association liked to brag in its newsletters about being environmentally responsible. They wanted the image of conservation without the reality of it, and my barrels had made that hypocritical gap visible. I pulled out the thick CCR binder again, flipping through pages with a highlighter and sticky notes until my fingers smelled like paper dust and ink. Buried deeper in the document, not under the highlighted sections someone had tabbed, I found a whole subsection about resource conservation initiatives. It encouraged individual efforts to reduce water waste and stormwater runoff, as long as they did not create structural damage or safety issues. There was nothing about barrels, nothing about their height or color, nothing about pre-approval for minor conservation devices. That discovery did not magically erase the courtesy notice, but it did change how I saw it. The board was not protecting safety, they were protecting their own sense of ownership over every square inch of visible space. The rules were less like laws and more like levers they pulled depending on who they wanted to control. I realized then that I was not just dealing with a misunderstanding, I was dealing with an abuse of power wrapped in polite legal phrases. I did not know yet that the lien would come later, or that my account would suddenly show a $500 hit for non-compliance, dated June 15th. I did not know that Marlene had already been sending photos to the committee, her messages full of claims about pests and eyesores and property values. What I knew, in that moment with the CCR binder open and the clock ticking on my 10 days, was that they were daring me to test whether conservation really mattered here or if everything was just about control. That courtesy notice joined my growing stack of evidence. I tucked it into a folder with the original water conservation pamphlet and a printout of the CCR section on resource conservation initiatives. It felt dramatic to start a folder, but something in me knew I might need a paper trail if this went further than a warning. In this kind of HOA nightmare, documentation is the only shield a homeowner really has. As the first few days of the 10-day countdown passed, it rained twice. Both times, the barrels did exactly what they were meant to do. They took the rushing downpour and turned it into a calm, contained flow. The sound shifted from a violent splash against concrete to a steady, controlled trickle inside plastic walls. The walkway stayed dry, and the low puddle near the gate never formed. I started using the captured water to rinse off my patio and water a few potted plants, feeling a small thrill every time I opened the spigot. It was my own tiny system, my small win against rising utility rates and pointless waste. The irony of being punished for something the association claimed to value made every gallon feel like a quiet act of resistance. At the same time, I knew that somewhere behind closed doors, someone was framing my barrels as a threat. By day 8 of the 10, I still had not responded to the courtesy notice. I wanted to be thoughtful, not reactive. I drafted and redrafted a letter in my head, explaining how the barrels functioned, noting that they were sealed, secured, and matched the color palette. I planned to reference the conservation pamphlet and the CCR section on resource initiatives, to show that my setup aligned with the association's stated values. At the same time, I was very aware that this was not truly about reason. It was about the board and people like Marlene deciding whether they would tolerate any sign that homeowners could act on their own without first begging for permission. I could feel that pressure in the way neighbors looked away when I walked by, as if they did not want to get pulled into a conflict they could sense brewing. The air around the mail kiosk felt heavier, like the humidity before a storm. One evening, as the sun sank and the streetlights blinked on with a faint hum, I watched Marlene stand at the far end of the walkway. She was on her phone, turning slightly so she had my back wall in frame, angling for the best shot of my barrels behind the shrubs. She never came close enough to talk, but her posture was a statement, she was not going to let this go. And if she was feeding the board images, I knew that my polite, reasonable letter alone might not be enough to stop them. I went back inside and put the courtesy notice, CCR printouts, and the most recent newsletter on my dining table. Under the warm overhead light, it looked like a miniature case file. On one side, there was the paper trail of the association praising conservation and encouraging individual efforts. On the other, a warning letter that treated my actual conservation effort as a nuisance. The contradiction was sharp enough to cut. In that clash between what they said and what they did, I started to see something I could use. I was not yet planning full retaliation or imagining a future where the board would have to face its own words, but the first seeds were planted. I realized that if they insisted on making an example out of me over these barrels, I could make an example out of them using their own rules. I also started to see how this small fight fit into a bigger pattern in the complex. This was not the first time the board had used vague language to clamp down on someone they did not like. It was just the first time they had picked a target who was willing to read every line of the CCR binder and remember dates, phrases, and contradictions. I was not just defending plastic barrels, I was defending my right to exist here without being micromanaged to the point of absurdity. As day 10 approached, the weather forecast called for another storm. The sky grew heavy, clouds stacking like layers of gray felt over the rooftops, and the air took on that metallic smell that comes right before rain. Another downpour would test everything, the barrels, the walkway, and the board's resolve. I stood by my back gate, listening to the first distant rumble of thunder, knowing that my 10 days were almost up and that whatever happened next would push this from a minor annoyance into something much bigger. And the board, without realizing it, was about to escalate from a simple warning into the kind of financial hit that proves exactly how far they were willing to go to enforce their HOA ridiculous rules. The storm hit on the last night of my 10-day window like it had been waiting for its cue. Rain hammered the roofs and drummed on the metal railings, turning the narrow walkways into shining streams of reflected light. From my back gate, I watched the downspout feed cleanly into the barrels, the water entering in a steady, controlled rush instead of exploding onto the concrete the way it used to. The air smelled metallic and fresh, and underneath the roar of the storm, the quiet efficiency of those barrels felt like proof that I was not the problem here. By morning, the barrels were nearly full and the walkway behind my unit was clean and dry. There was no slick puddle at the gate, no standing water for mosquitoes, no muddy splash along the siding. I took photos from every angle, how close they sat to the wall, how the overflow still went into the existing drain, how neat and contained everything was. Then I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the courtesy notice in front of me and finally wrote my response. I kept it calm and factual. I referenced the section on resource conservation initiatives, listed the safety features of the barrels, and attached screenshots from the association's own newsletter praising rainwater harvesting. I made a point of saying I was open to adjustments, screening, additional anchoring, even a neutral privacy panel, if the board had specific concerns. Most importantly, I sent it by email and dropped a hard copy at the management office so there would be no question about whether I had answered within the 10 days. The next few days were quiet on the surface. No one slid another notice under my door, and no official email arrived. But I could feel attention tightening around my unit the way humidity builds before another storm. People lingered a little longer near my back gate, glancing over, pretending to adjust their shoes or check their phones while their eyes flicked to the barrels. The first real sign that the board had not been convinced came in the form of a thicker envelope. It arrived on a hot afternoon when the sun bounced hard off the white-trimmed windows and the mailboxes radiated heat when you touched them. Inside was not a friendly acknowledgement of my letter but a formal violation notice, printed on heavier paper that still smelled faintly of warm toner. The heading was bold and sharp, second notice, failure to comply with courtesy warning. This new notice referenced a different section of the CCRs, this time, not just section 4.3 but also a section under enforcement procedures. It laid out a schedule of fines, an initial penalty, followed by additional charges if the offending condition remained. They had marked my alleged offending condition as unapproved water storage devices adjacent to common walkway, and they claimed I had failed to respond, even though I had hard proof that my email had gone through. At the bottom, in a small but deadly font, it stated that if the situation was not corrected, the board reserved the right to levy fines that could become a lien against my account. The dates on the notice made my jaw clench. The courtesy notice had been dated May 30th, this second letter was dated June 10th, claiming I had ignored their first warning. In reality, my response had gone out on June 4th, well within their 10-day window. It did not matter, on paper, they had already written the story as if I had chosen defiance over cooperation. Enclosed behind the letter was something new, a one-page enforcement policy, adopted April 3rd, printed like an official exhibit. It described how fines would be calculated and when liens could be recorded if a homeowner refused to comply. There was a small note at the bottom referencing something called the mailbox rule from CCR section 10.5, basically saying that once a notice was sent, it was considered delivered. It was a policy that turned their version of events into the only version they cared to recognize. That enforcement sheet became my second key piece of evidence. I slid it into my folder, behind the conservation pamphlet and the courtesy notice, and added a sticky note with the dates and how they conflicted with my email record. They wanted to turn paper into a weapon, I was starting to turn it into a shield. At the same time, I could not ignore what this meant. We had officially moved from polite warning to a track that led straight toward money. The formal violation notice informed me that the board would be holding a compliance hearing on June 14th to decide on fines if I had not removed the barrels. It said I was invited to attend to offer any relevant information, a phrase that sounded polite but carried the weight of judgment already made. The hearing would be in the small community room near the pool, the same space they used for holiday events and potlucks, now repurposed into a courtroom for plastic barrels. The heat outside made the pool water glitter through the glass, but all I could think about was sitting in a folding chair under fluorescent lights while people who barely knew me debated whether I was a problem to be punished. I thought about taking the barrels down just to avoid it. But that would mean accepting a story that said I was wrong for doing exactly what their own materials encouraged. It would mean letting Marlene and whoever else was whispering in board members' ears decide where the line fell between eco-conscious and violation. The abuse of power was subtle but very real, and if I caved now, it would not be the last time they used it. So I circled the hearing date on my calendar, printed out my email logs, and added them to the folder. The sound of my printer humming in the quiet unit felt like a steady, stubborn heartbeat. By the time June 14th rolled around, my file was thick enough to feel weighty in my hands, a reminder that I was not coming into that room empty. They had paper, I had paper too. The community room on the evening of the hearing felt colder than it had any right to be. The air conditioning hummed loudly, making the fluorescent light seem even harsher against the cream-colored walls. Metal chairs were set in a half-circle facing a folding table where 3 board members sat, with a 4th chair for the property manager and a neat stack of folders in front of them. My name was on one of those folders, written on the tab in a tidy hand that made the whole thing feel oddly personal. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontations. They thanked me for coming, glanced at my file, and spoke in the slow, measured tones of people reminding themselves they were in control. I explained my barrels, the sealed lids, the diverter, the prevention of walkway flooding. I referenced the conservation section of the CCRs and the newsletter praising rainwater harvesting, setting my folder on the table so they could see the highlighted lines. They listened, or pretended to. The property manager nodded at my details, but the treasurer kept flipping back to the enforcement policy, as if that piece of paper mattered more than anything I said. Someone mentioned precedent, worried that allowing my barrels would mean accepting all kinds of unsightly equipment in the future. They talked about uniformity, community standards, and property values, leaning on abstract phrases while ignoring the practical reality of water that no longer flooded the walkway. When it was over, they said they would deliberate and notify me of the outcome in writing. I walked back to my unit under the darkening sky, the last light fading behind the rows of townhomes while cicadas buzzed faintly in the trees. The barrels were still there, quietly doing their job, the plastic sides cool and solid under my hand when I brushed past them. But I could feel it in my chest, the board was not planning to back down. Their decision arrived faster than I expected. On June 16th, the day after the hearing, I logged into my online account to pay my regular assessment and saw it. That thin gray line item, non-compliance fee, June 15th, unauthorized exterior apparatus, $500. It was the same line that had opened this whole narration, but now I had the full context behind it. $500 is not just an annoying fee. In a system where the association can snowball fines and late charges and eventually attach them to your home, it is the first stone in an avalanche. If they could pin a $500 lien-worthy charge on something as basic as catching rainwater, what else could they decide to price at a level high enough to make people submit out of fear? The enforcement policy sheet had warned that unpaid fines could become a lien against the owner's interest, and the ledger entry made that possibility feel very real. The date on the fee, June 15th, was the same day they had silently decided that my explanation and evidence did not matter. I had shown them proof of my compliance with their own conservation values. They had responded by rewriting me as a problem to be punished. That was the moment the story stopped being about barrels and started being about power. I called the management office, not to argue, but to ask for a copy of the official hearing minutes. They informed me that board deliberations are confidential, but they sent me a brief summary, a one-page outline listing that the board had considered testimony, reviewed photographs provided by a neighboring owner, and upheld enforcement of CCR Section 4.3. No detail about the conservation section, no mention of their own pamphlet, no acknowledgement of my documented response. It was like part of the story had been erased from the official record. Still, even that sparse summary became another piece for my folder. I printed it, underlined the references to neighboring owner, and slid it behind the enforcement policy. The folder had grown heavy now, edges frayed with handling, sticky notes marking dates like May 30th, June 4th, June 10th, June 14th, June 15th, June 16th. I started to see my own private timeline forming, one that did not match the neat, controlled version the board was trying to commit to paper. Neighbors began to feel the ripple. I noticed how some people stopped making eye contact near the mailboxes, or how conversations would soften when I walked by. When I sat by the pool one evening, I overheard a couple of owners quietly mentioning the water barrel situation, their eyes cutting quickly in my direction before sliding away. The shame they were trying to pin to me was not just about aesthetics, it was about sending a warning to everyone else: step out of line, and you will be next. What they did not realize was that every new document they sent me, every vague phrase and offhand reference, was another small tool I could use later. I read the CCRs more closely than I had ever read anything in school, tracing cross-references, noting contradictions, and marking sections where their process seemed thin or inconsistent. Under CCR Section 10.5, the same part that mentioned the mailbox rule, I found language requiring good faith consideration of mitigating factors before imposing significant fines. Nowhere in their sparse summary did they mention that they had simply rubber-stamped a punishment. By late June, the story was simple on paper. I installed rain barrels, ignored a warning, lost at a hearing, and got a $500 non-compliance charge tied to my account. But beneath that version ran the truth. I stayed within their conservation values, answered on time, documented everything, and watched the board bend its own rules to protect its control. The abuse of power was not loud. It showed up in the quiet omission of facts and the casual way a big number appeared on my ledger as if it were nothing. I knew that if I let it stand, I would be accepting their version not only for myself but for anyone else they chose to target next. Still, I did not want to rush into something reckless. I wanted my response to be deliberate, precise, and grounded in the very rules they loved to quote at me. So I kept reading, kept gathering, kept listening. One night in late June, I was skimming the association website when I stumbled on something I had never really noticed: archived board agendas. They were simple PDFs, usually a page or two long, listing the items the board planned to discuss each month. Curious, I pulled up the agenda from April, the same month their enforcement policy had been adopted. Halfway down the page, right under Enforcement Policy Review, was an item labeled Water Conservation and Stormwater Compliance Discussion. That agenda line became my third major prop. I printed the April agenda, highlighted that line, and added it to my folder as Board Agenda Excerpt, April Meeting. If they had discussed water conservation as a board-level topic, there might be minutes somewhere that connected their public commitment to conservation with what they were now punishing me for doing. Even if I could not access every word, the existence of that agenda item hinted at a gap between their public posture and their private enforcement. The July newsletter arrived folded neatly in my mailbox as the late afternoon sun turned the asphalt in the parking lot into a wavering mirror. On the front, there was a cheerful blurb about our community's commitment to sustainable living, complete with a small stock photo of a rain chain trickling into a decorative basin. Inside, a short note praised residents who had found creative ways to support water-wise landscaping within CCR guidelines. There was no mention of my barrels, no mention of the hearing, no hint that the same board praising creative conservation was also using that enforcement policy to stamp out the most practical example of it. Reading that newsletter, I felt something click into place. They were not just enforcing rules, they were curating an image of the community that only included efforts they personally controlled or approved. Independent action, especially visible, practical action, was a threat to that curated picture. If they could punish it into submission, they would preserve their version of eco-conscious without ever facing their own contradictions. That realization is what pushed me from defensive to strategic. I was done just reacting. It was time to think about how to use their own system against them. The abuse of power lived in the gaps between what they said and what they did, and those gaps were starting to look like fault lines I could pry open. I did not know yet exactly how the revenge would land, but I knew the ground it would stand on: their own documents, their own words, their own conservation claims. The first step of my quiet retaliation started small, almost boringly procedural. I drafted a formal written appeal, not just to the board, but also addressed to the management company and copied to the generic email address for our city's Environmental Services Department. In it, I laid out the timeline as cleanly as a case file: dates of notices, date of my email, hearing date, date of the $500 charge. I attached photos of the barrels, excerpts of CCR sections about conservation and good faith consideration, the April agenda excerpt, and the newsletter's water-wise praise. The appeal did not argue that the board had no right to enforce aesthetic standards. Instead, it argued that their enforcement had become inconsistent and retaliatory when it came to actual conservation measures. I asked for an internal review of whether their enforcement policy aligned with their own conservation language and whether they had applied it fairly in my case. By copying the city environmental department, I wasn't making a legal threat. I was putting their behavior in front of the exact people whose praise they wanted when they bragged about being eco-conscious. That email, with its attachments and careful wording, was the first quiet blow in a different direction. It did not remove the $500 charge overnight, and it did not make the barrels suddenly invisible to Marlene and her clipboard. But it changed the terrain. The board could no longer pretend this was just a private matter between one stubborn owner and their policies. Their own public conservation image was now part of the conversation. Up until that point, they had controlled the story inside the complex, painting me as the difficult homeowner who refused to comply. What they did not realize yet was that I was about to flip that script and show the rest of the community, and a few people outside it, exactly how far the board would go to punish someone for doing the very thing they claimed to value. And as I hit send on that appeal and closed my laptop, the room lit by the pale glow of the screen and the faint buzz of the ceiling fan, I knew this fight was no longer just about me or two plastic barrels. It was about exposing a pattern of control dressed up as concern. My next moves would not be loud or reckless. They would be meticulous, slow, and aimed right at the heart of that pattern. The association had weaponized its paperwork. Now it was my turn to show them what happened when someone read it more carefully than they ever expected. The appeal I sent out felt, at first, like tossing a small stone into a big pond. For a few days, nothing obvious changed. The management office did not reply beyond an auto-response acknowledging receipt, and the environmental services address stayed silent. The only immediate difference was inside my own unit, where my worn folder sat open on the dining table, papers spread like a map of every way the board had twisted its power. Outside, summer settled in heavy and bright. The heat pressed against the windows, and the hum of distant air conditioners blended with the sound of cars moving slowly through the cramped parking lot. The barrels stood in their usual place behind my unit, dark green and steady, catching the occasional afternoon shower and quietly proving, over and over, that they were part of the solution, not the problem. If this had been just a petty dispute, that might have been the end of it. But a few small things began to shift. One neighbor, who had always nodded politely but never stopped to chat, paused by the mailboxes to ask, in a low voice, whether it was true that the board had charged me hundreds of dollars over rainwater. Another slipped an anonymous note under my door, thanking me for standing up on the water thing, and mentioning that they had wanted to install a small barrel too but were afraid of being targeted. The social shame the board had tried to push onto me was starting to bend back in their direction, subtle but noticeable. Then an email arrived from the environmental services contact I had copied. It was polite, almost bland. They thanked me for raising questions around residential stormwater practices and said they were always interested in how communities are implementing conservation. They attached a short, generic fact sheet about best practices for rain capture and noted that they occasionally hosted outreach events for associations that wanted to showcase their water-wise initiatives. Reading between the lines, I saw it, they were not threatening the board, but they were offering attention. Attention the association usually loved, as long as it made them look good. If the board wanted to bask in the glow of being seen as responsible and eco-conscious, they might now have to defend why they punished the most visible conservation effort in the complex. I forwarded the response to the board and management, adding only a brief message, that I appreciated the city's resources and wondered whether our association might be interested in participating in one of those outreach events, given all the newsletter talk about sustainability. Then I attached my photos of the barrels again, framed not as a rebellion, but as an example of exactly the kind of rain capture the city encouraged. I did not threaten, demand, or name any legal action. I simply placed their public image and their private enforcement side by side and asked which one they wanted to live with. The board had gotten used to holding all the power inside our walls, where their version of events became reality. Now there was a new possibility hovering just outside those walls. If they clung to their punishment, they risked having to explain, to outsiders who cared about conservation, why they chose to make an example out of a homeowner whose only crime was doing what their own pamphlets celebrated. The turning point came packaged in something deceptively boring, a notice announcing the agenda for the next open board meeting. It landed in our email inboxes on a warm evening, while the sky outside glowed orange and the smell of someone grilling drifted faintly through my open window. The agenda was the usual mix of line items, budget updates, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, until I reached a line near the bottom, review of water conservation policy and owner concerns. That single phrase told me two things. First, my appeal had landed harder than they wanted to admit. Second, they were preparing to talk about it where other owners could hear. The meeting would be held in the same community room as my hearing, but this time the chairs would not be arranged like a courtroom, they would be set up for owners to sit and listen. I arrived early the night of the meeting. The community room felt cooler than the heavy air outside, the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights mixing with the faint echo of splashing from the pool beyond the glass. A handful of owners trickled in, some clutching copies of the newsletter, others holding their own mental lists of complaints about parking, noise, or landscaping. At the front of the room, the board members shuffled their papers, trying to look calm and brisk while avoiding my eye just a second too long. When water conservation policy and owner concerns came up on the agenda, the vice president announced that the association was always striving to balance sustainability with aesthetics and safety. They referenced recent confusion about what kind of rainwater equipment was allowed and mentioned that the board had received inquiries about a specific enforcement action. They did not say my name, but everyone who had heard even a whisper of the barrel story knew exactly who they meant. They opened the floor for comments, and the room stayed quiet for a heartbeat too long. Then one owner, the same person who had slipped the anonymous note under my door, raised a hand and asked bluntly whether it was true that someone had been fined hundreds of dollars for a closed, safe rain barrel system. Another owner followed, asking why the newsletter talked about creative conservation if the board punished the first person who actually tried something meaningful. The questions were not hostile, but they were clear, and they chipped away at the board's comfort. I waited until others had spoken before I stood up. When I walked to the front where owners usually stood to address the board, the air felt cooler closer to the AC vent, and the glow from the overhead lights made the papers in my folder almost too bright. I did not raise my voice. I simply laid out the same timeline I had shared in my appeal, the dates, the notices, the hearing, the $500 charge dated June 15th. I held up the conservation pamphlet, the newsletter with its rainwater praise, and the April agenda excerpt referencing water conservation and stormwater compliance. Each piece of paper made a soft flap as I set it on the table in front of them, like cards in a game they thought they had already won. Then I mentioned the email from Environmental Services, and how they had offered to feature associations that wanted to showcase their water-wise efforts. I did not accuse anyone of malice, I did not threaten to bring in lawyers or file formal complaints. I just asked a simple question: how could our community claim to be a model of sustainability while punishing exactly the kind of rain capture they praised in writing? The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel like gravity pressing down on the room. The president finally said they would review the matter in light of new information, and moved the meeting on to the next topic. That phrase, new information, hung in the air, even though nothing I had presented was truly new. What had changed was the audience. The same owners the board liked to describe as engaged in newsletters had now seen the gap between image and behavior up close. The week after the meeting, the complex felt different in small ways. People nodded more openly when they passed me near the mailboxes. A couple of owners started asking questions about the barrels themselves, how the diverter worked, whether it really prevented puddles on the walkway, how hard it had been to install. The story was shifting. I was no longer just the person in trouble with the board, I was the one who had pushed back on something that felt wrong, and other people were paying attention. The board, to its credit or its panic, reacted faster this time. 3 days after the meeting, I received a new letter from the management office stamped policy clarification. Inside, their language was careful. They announced that the board had revisited its approach to individual conservation measures, and would be updating guidelines for rainwater capture devices to better align with community values and external recommendations. The letter laid out new conditions: barrels needed to be sealed, neutral in color, securely attached, and placed in locations that did not obstruct walkways or create drainage issues. Reading through the list, I realized that my setup already met every single condition. They had essentially reverse-engineered their rules to match what I had done from the start. Buried in the second paragraph was the part that mattered most to me. Given the revised guidelines, the board has elected, as a one-time exception, to waive previously imposed non-compliance fees related to rainwater capture devices that meet these standards. It took me a second to absorb that sentence. They did not admit they had been wrong, they did not apologize. But they were wiping out the $500 charge that had sat on my ledger like a threat. The money was gone before it could harden into a recorded lien, and my barrels were now, by their own new rules, fully permissible. They thought they were getting away with a gracious policy update, but I knew exactly what had happened. Backed into a corner between their own conservation claims, neighbor scrutiny, and the possibility of outside attention, the board had chosen quiet surrender over public embarrassment. The same system they had used to punish me, agenda items, policy memos, enforcement procedures, had become the pathway for my vindication. When I checked my account online 2 days later, the ledger told the story in numbers. The entry for non-compliance fee, June 15, unauthorized exterior apparatus, $500, had been offset by a new line, fee reversal, policy adjustment, $500. The balance dropped back to normal, and a small note in the corner said, account in good standing. The threat that had been lurking behind that fee, the possibility of a lien curling quietly around my home like invisible barbed wire, vanished. I printed that page and slid it into my folder as the final piece of the case. The folder that had started with a little conservation pamphlet and a courtesy notice now ended with proof that the board had retreated without ever saying the word surrender. Out my back window, the barrels sat under the eaves, catching the late afternoon rain in a steady rhythm, the sound a soft clatter that felt more triumphant than any speech. The fallout took longer, but it came. Marlene, the neighbor who had started this with her phone camera and whispered complaints, did not vanish. She still walked the complex with a clipboard sometimes, still fussed about porch decorations and trash bins left out too long. But she lost something less visible, the sense that the board would always back her without question. People who once flinched under her gaze now remembered how far her crusade over my barrels had gone, and how it had ultimately ended with the association folding. At the next annual meeting, one of the board's seats opened up unexpectedly when a longtime member chose not to run again. An owner from a different row of townhomes put their name forward, someone who had spoken up at the conservation policy meeting. Their quiet campaign focused not on revenge, but on transparency and consistency, especially around enforcement. When the ballots were counted, that owner got the seat. No one said my barrels were the reason, but I could see the connection in the way people talked after the meeting, relieved to feel that something had shifted in the balance of power. Months later, the complex no longer felt like a maze patrolled by a single set of eyes. The board still sent out reminders and newsletters, but the tone changed. When they wrote about conservation now, they included actual examples from our community, not just stock photos. One newsletter even highlighted a resident's rainwater collection system as a model of safe, effective stormwater management, describing features that matched my barrels almost exactly without naming me. I read that entry with a half smile, the glow of my bedside lamp spilling over the page, and thought about how strange it was to become a silent example in their new story. My barrels stayed in place, legally blessed now, quietly doing their job every time the sky opened. The walkway behind my unit no longer flooded, the gate never sat in a stagnant puddle. I used the collected water for plants and cleaning, always a little aware that what had once been labeled unauthorized exterior apparatus had outlived its sentence and turned into a symbol of something bigger. Every time I turned the spigot and heard the splash into a watering can, it reminded me that you do not always win by shouting, sometimes you win by outreading, outdocumenting, and outlasting. The folder of evidence stayed on a shelf in my closet. I did not need it day to day, but knowing it was there gave me a quiet sense of security, a record of how the board could be challenged and how their own rules could be bent back toward fairness. It was not about nursing a grudge, it was about remembering that abuse of power thrives on silence and forgetfulness, and it weakens every time someone refuses to let the story be rewritten without a fight. Looking back, the $500 fee and the threat of a lien had felt, in the moment, like a huge weight crushing down on me and on the idea that a homeowner could make a simple, sensible improvement without asking permission like a child. Now, in the cooler light of hindsight, I saw it for what it was, the board overplaying its hand, exposing just how fragile its authority looked once people actually paid attention to the paperwork behind it. Their attempt to make an example out of me had backfired, turning their own conservation rhetoric into the lever that pried their grip loose. The complex was still a cramped grid of attached units, thin walls, and echoing sidewalks. There were still petty disputes and passive-aggressive notes and the occasional flare-up over parking or noise. But the atmosphere had changed. The board knew now that at least some of us were willing to read the CCRs as carefully as they did, to track dates and decisions and hold them to the standards they claimed to uphold. I did not become friends with Marlene, we kept a polite distance. Sometimes we would see each other at the mailboxes, and there would be a brief nod, nothing more. Behind our units, her side remained barrel-free, just a bare downspout splashing directly onto the concrete when it rained. Every time I saw the water pooling there after a storm, I remembered how this entire saga had started and felt a small, private satisfaction that my side of the walkway stayed clear because I had refused to obey blindly. In the end, my revenge was not flashy or loud. It did not involve yelling matches or dramatic confrontations. It was the satisfaction of watching the system that tried to crush me twist back on itself, forced to recognize that its own rules and values, when held up to the light, did not support what it had done. My barrels stayed, the fee vanished, the policy changed, and the balance of power shifted just enough that people began to notice. Tell me your wildest rain barrel HOA horror in one line.